Hello, today is December 5th, 2021, is the 67th episode of New Paradigms. I'm your host, Sargis Sangari. My special honor guest today is a dear friend of mine who is celebrating her 100th birthday on December 6th, which is going to be tomorrow. Captain Betty Horstman is a member of the VFW, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, Chapter 3579 or Post 3579, which I am also a lifetime member of. And she has worked at the NIOS Post Commander between 2004 and 2006, while also volunteering with the American Legion. Betty joined the United States Army Medical Corps in 1944 and served the nation through 1946, earning the Asiatic Pacific Theater Medal, the American Arena Medal, the World War II Victory Medal, the Cold War Victory Medal, and also the Meritorious Service Citation with 1 star. Given her courageous service in the South Pacific, attending to the wounded and the POWs from the Battle of Saipan, which claimed 55,000 soldiers and civilian lives in over just 3 weeks of fighting in the summer of 1944, where she was assigned her own personal bodyguards to secure her, given active resistance that were still being encountered on the island even a month after the major combat operations were completed. She served the wounded also at the Great Mariana Turkey Shoot, where the U.S. decimated the Japanese carrier task force, sinking 3 of their carriers and also shooting down 330 of the 340 planes that were launched on that day against our forces. I would be remiss if I did not also thank Betty's husband, who also served, Harold, who earned the Bronze Star in the Pacific, which Betty proudly displays on her license plate today. Before we bring Betty in, I do want to take this opportunity to show a short video as to how the women in the United States came to the call of duty and supported our nation.
Busy Times Square in New York is jammed in tribute to 100 young women who are to be inducted into the Women's Army Corps as part of WWII Recruiting Week over the entire nation. These proud recruits are being sworn into the Corps by Colonel Sumner Waite. America is grateful to these girls who are freeing men to fight.
Betty, it's an absolute honor to have you here today with us. Let me be the first person to welcome you to the beginning of a new century in your life and the next blessed chapter of your lifetime. On behalf of the men and women of the VFW that you belong to, God bless you for everything you do for us, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm privileged to share my experiences with you.
Betty, I would like to start to see, as you saw the young women who were initially volunteering to be in the service. I know that you had attended the Mayo Clinic. You were doing your studies when initially the recruiters came talk to you. Tell us about what made you want to serve and what was the reaction at home?
My father was absolutely committed that I should do something in the medical field. Actually, he wanted to be a dentist. I could not even bear the thought of being a dentist. I explored various medical options and decided it would be physical therapy. I truly wanted to be a doctor, but since I'm afraid of needles and can't stand the sight of them, medicine was ruled out. Nursing also was ruled out because of the hatred of needles, which exists to this day. X-ray did not have hands-on except to position a patient. I don't really recall how I found the field of physical therapy. There were not that many schools that offered physical therapy at that time. I was fortunate that Mayo Clinic had a program in their School of Medicine. So after I graduated from the University of Michigan, within 3 months, I was at Mayo Clinic. Of course, it's kind of hard to think positively all the time about Mayo Clinic. It was so cold. I mean, to be in Minnesota in the winter is miserable. And of course, Mayo Clinic at that time just had the one location in Rochester, Minnesota. The course, because of the war, was shortened from 2 years to 6 months at Mayo. And then I was put in civil service and sent to an Army hospital for 6 months. After the 6 months in Texas at Harmon General Hospital in Longview, Texas, we were heavily recruited because of our profession. I really wanted the Navy, but I ended up in the Army. I don't recall why the Navy didn't really want me. I seem to recall because I am and still very nearsighted, so the Navy said, no. Army took 32 of our 34 graduates from Mayo that year. All of us went in service. After Mayo, I was sent to a basic training in Fort Sam Houston. I clearly did not want to go to Europe. I do not like the cold, and I'd had my big taste of it in Minnesota. You would ask, where are we going to send you? And they would never tell you. After basic training, which included how to hold a rifle, how to shoot a rifle, how to put on a gas mask, I was sent to another hospital, Brooke General Hospital, for the basic training. I had to learn how to crawl on my belly through a tunnel. Basic training was not easy. And I was fortunate in having grown up in a privileged family. I had my own car when I was 14. Of course, I cheated, didn't have a driver's license yet. But to have to take orders in the Army was very, very difficult for me. I was in the Army Medical Corps, the Nurses Corps, which was fortunate and unfortunate. Nurses at that time did not understand much about my profession. You mentioned that I'm going to be 100, and I share 100 years birthday with my professional association, the American Physical Therapy Association. In basic training was brutal. From basic training, they sent me to Fort Lewis in Seattle. We were again told nothing. We had to be on the base until noon of every day. After 12 o'clock, we were free to do whatever we wanted in Seattle. I spent all my spare time in the bowling alley. I wanted to be a very serious bowler. And I succeeded pretty well. I'm still a pretty good bowler. Still bowl in 2 leagues, 2 senior leagues, of course. One morning, we were told we were going to be shipping out. They took us by bus to a ship. And for 4 or 5 miserable days, I was on that ship. Again, they wouldn't tell us where we're going. I was so seasick that my fellow cabin mates made sure I had the bottom bunk because I was throwing up so constantly. I was never so glad to see land, which turned out to be Honolulu. To get off that ship, I must have lost plenty of weight throwing up. In Honolulu, I was assigned to Tripler General Hospital, to a satellite of the hospital. It was a clinic called Mosquito Gulch. which housed mainly Italian prisoners of war who were recovering from malaria and fractures of nothing really serious. It was extremely difficult to try and practice physical therapy with the Italian prisoners of war. They had no desire to get better. And in my profession, motivation is the key to getting better, because we're just basically teachers. If you do this exercise, your arm will get stronger. If you do this exercise, your leg will get stronger. Well, the prisoners of war had no desire to get better. I was there approximately 2 months treating the Italian prisoners of war. When we were told to board a plane, there was 5 or 6 nurses, 1 Red Cross, and myself. We boarded this plane. I don't know how many hours we were in the air. We landed on Johnson Island, which was a step to eventually would be Guam. When we landed, the field was brilliantly lit. And the field was covered with GIs. We basically landed on Johnson Island just to have a meal. When I asked someone, well, what were all the GIs there for? They said they had not seen American women in months. So basically, they're just staring at us. From Johnson Island, went on, and I landed in what turned out to be Guam. I was there just 1 day, or maybe 2 at the most, when I was told to board a plane, and I landed at Saipan, where I stayed for the next 2 years. On Saipan, I was assigned first to a station hospital where we treated minor injuries, fractures, nothing serious. The major injuries went to the general hospital. From the station hospital, I went on to a rehab hospital, and then finally at the general hospital. Attached to the general hospital was a prisoner of war compound, and I had Japanese prisoners of war as patients. They were absolutely wonderful, wonderful patients. They were a lot like Trump. They refused to believe the war was over. So, of course, they wanted to get well. They were very, very tall. At that time in my life, I was 5 foot, almost 5'5". Today I'm 5'2", but I'm going to be 100. They were much taller than me. It turned out they were mainly Japanese Imperial Marines. They were very tall for Japanese. As I say, their morale was terrific. I also, of course, had American patients. American patients didn't have as much motivation as the Japanese because they had no incentive to get well. They were a little bit like my Italian prisoners of war. But if the American patients got well, they simply went back into fighting. So why should they get well? The savior to my profession were the Japanese prisoners of war who really wanted to get well. The Army gave me a small orange booklet with Japanese phrases, which I tried to communicate with the patients. It was much easier to gesture than try and look up the words in the booklet the Army gave me. In my second year on Saipan, which would have been 46, we heard rumors something major was going to happen. I mean, the rumor went through all of us on Saipan. I should mention that my mother had contacted her family in Minnesota. It turned out I had a cousin on the island. After he found out that I was there, he looked me up because I was an officer, and officers were allowed to buy 3 bottles of whiskey or scotch and 1 case of beer a month. At that time, I did not drink, so I was very happy to give my cousin this liquor. I'm sure he was extremely popular. What turned out to be a rumor was, in fact, a very major invasion, which was Iwo Jima. I was anxious to get off Saipan. I wanted to get back to the States. And incidentally, the Army had promised me, no, you're not going to go overseas. Don't worry about it. Sure. Months later, I was overseas. But as I mentioned, I like to bowl, and I wanted to bowl again. On Saipan, all I could do was throw little coconuts, which is not very exciting or rewarding. Positively, I enjoyed the time in the service once I learned how to take orders, which wasn't easy. Negatively, housing was horrible. Lived in a Quonset hut, which is like a barrel on its side. It was very hot and very humid. In order to keep my boots from mildewing, I was told to keep a light burning all the time in the area where my clothes hung, which slowed down the mildew. And the food, awful, awful, awful. I blossomed from 120 pounds to 140 because all I lived on was chocolate drinks, avocados, pineapples that grew on the island, bananas, and occasional food my mother was able to ship. All we had was mutton, 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 mutton. To this day, I will not eat lamb. The taste and smell of that horrible mutton, horrible. So living on chocolate milk, I blew up to 140. So that was the bad part, was the food and the housing, really, and having to take orders from nurses who knew nothing at that time about my profession. This was the 40s. There were not that many schools of physical therapy in the United States at that time. Today, we have at least 7 schools in Illinois. So finally, I said to the captain that was in charge of that particular medical unit, I cannot deal with nurses. So he said, fine, take your orders from me, which saved my life. Otherwise, I probably would have been discharged, dishonorably discharged, because I could not. A nurse would tell me, you shouldn't do that exercise, you shouldn't do this. And of course, I was only a second lieutenant, and they were captains, lieutenant colonels. Anyway, that doctor saved my life, and I will never forget him. To this day, I don't know if Morris Schiffman is still alive, but he saved my life in Saipan. I have absolutely no regrets about my time in service. Taught me to follow rules. If you follow rules, you can get by with things. I also learned how to teach other people, which is not part of a curriculum of physical therapy. I had to teach GIs how to help me in the clinic. Of course, I had to prepare a clinic. They didn't have physical therapy when I first landed on Saipan. After Iwo Jima, I volunteered for Japan. But by that time, I was the only physical therapist left on the island, so they would not release me. I could not go home until a person replaced me, which was another, to me, stupid rule. Why do I have to sit here on Saipan and waiting for somebody to replace me? my father was able to pull some strings and get me on the way back to the United States, but still I had to wait for that replacement. I was transferred from a Saipan back to Oahu, but I had to wait there until that miserable person replaced me on Saipan before I could go back to the United States. Once I was discharged, I used everything I had learned in the service, how to organize departments, how to run a department. And there was a new hospital opening up in Chicago by the name of Resurrection. I applied for the job there, and they gave me the job of chief therapist. So I coordinated PT, OT, and speech in the 10 years that I was at Resurrection. After 10 years, another new hospital decided to open up. It was not a new hospital, it was an old hospital that had built a new hospital. It was on the south side of Chicago called Holy Cross. So for 2 years, I commuted from the north side of Chicago to the south side and established a department there. Again, I was the chief of PTOT and speech. Then a third new hospital opened up. Since I had successfully opened up 2 hospitals, they contacted me to open up this new hospital, which turned out to be St. Joseph Hospital, which on the lake. This was a wonderful department because it's the first time in my professional career that I had a department that had windows. Everything else was in the basement. This one overlooked the lake. So it was a wonderful hospital. While there, I became aware that we would upgrade patients, send them back to their home or to a nursing home. In a few months, they'd be back. They would be weak, unable to walk. So since I worked for a Catholic hospital, I requested and was able to have an interview with the Arch Diocese of Chicago, the Archbishop. They said, your nurses don't know how to do anything in the form of rehab or restorative nursing. He said, when I explained to him, we send the patient back to XYZ nursing home, and then they come back to us unable to walk again. I said, your nurses have to learn how to do this. He said, well, they don't know. I said, I'll develop a program, which I did. And I became the PT consultant to the Archdiocese of Chicago. And I set up a training program of 2 weeks for registered nurses, teaching them the basics of rehab. And then that was just a simple step to do a similar program for AIDS. And that program became a 3-day program for AIDS, basic rehab techniques such as how to teach them to walk, how to transfer a patient, how to get patients motivated. So I really have the Army to thank for that, because they taught me to think outside the box.
Well, Betty, I got to tell you, kind of looking at everything you just said, sometimes, God answers your question in mysterious ways. You didn't want to go to Europe. You don't like the cold in Minnesota. So you were sent to a warm climate. Unfortunately, it was Saipan. And the reason that I, couldn't contain sometimes my, laughter in the process of you telling the story, because being a soldier, I know exactly what you went through. The only difference was we had similarly served in Fort Lewis, Washington. But when you were bowling, I was too busy drinking at the Irish pubs. So for me, having the opportunity to buy 3 bottles of whiskey on Saipan, I probably would have ended my career there rather than allowing me to think like you did, fighting back against the nurses who didn't know how the entire physical therapy process works. And as you said, you're celebrating 100 years of really your profession, physical therapy, which you literally created on the battlefields of Saipan and other locations. And I know it must have been very difficult to have to gone through that process. One thing I do want to go back on what you did on the battlefield, because, I just finished physical therapy myself on a surgery that was done just this past Tuesday. When you walk into the facility, you have all the equipment that you need. But when you were in combat area of operation, what did you do when they didn't have the equipment that you needed to be able to get the individuals up to par? What did you use at your disposal in the battlefield that could have been used to be able to heal those soldiers?
I had to ask the kitchen to save large bottles, which we filled with fluid, so we could use those as weight they could lift. I had to ask the engineers assigned to our hospital or clinic and show them, draw them in a diagram of how to make parallel bars. So I had to basically suggest the equipment I needed and have someone make them as makeshift as they could.
As you say, Betty, sometimes, soldiers, as reluctant as they are sometimes, they still, are there and they do their job. I know it was difficult just for your parents to see you want to deploy, especially you were very ahead of your time at that time, being a young lady who actually, after high school, decided to go to college and then attend Mayo Clinic. And then when you came back and you started the physical therapy programs in support of our various different locations here in Chicago, Illinois itself, I do know that you also went back and completed some of your advanced studies, which you didn't have to do, but you did it because you wanted to make sure you had at least those degrees established to be able to support the various different organizations, to include the Arch Diocese. How do you think that your so-called profession has developed now? Do you think that you were able to have major effects inside of that profession? Do you see it to be more independent? How would you see it change maybe in the future or the next century that is coming up to better assist maybe healing of the soldiers and others possibly?
I was instrumental in being a charter member in developing a new section in our professional association. That was called the geriatric section, where we made it our mission to develop programs for caregivers as well as patients. That section is now called the Academy of Geriatric Specialists. So I had an impact on my profession, yes. I was very active also locally, not only nationally, but I was president of the Illinois chapter of physical therapy, still pushing geriatrics and teaching, which was not part of our curriculum. Physical therapy school was how to do this, how to do a massage, how to do exercise, but not how to be an administrator or a teacher. So that was my mission, geriatrics. And
Betty, as you develop these programs, looking back now, do you, and I know that you always have said the military really gave you that opportunity to learn these, but I got to tell you, I think you would have been successful regardless of if you had been in the military or not, based on your approach to things. And I do sometimes soldiers who buck against authority are able to at least be more independent, and they don't just buck against it just to buck against it. They buck against it because they want to make sure they see things that others don't. As you're approaching your birthday again, which is going to be tomorrow, and I'm glad we're going to get an opportunity to celebrate it today with the members of the VFW, but what word of advice as a last word, if you could give us, for those who are followed your footsteps as we have served ourselves in the military? What advice do you have to give us and maybe the future generations as to what should be our approach through our lifetime when it comes to service to the nation?
I would strongly encourage women to consider joining one of the services. Other than that, I would encourage any female to volunteer their services, no matter what area they're expert in. You must volunteer because you must continue to sell your profession or sell yourself. If I had to do it again, I would not make a different choice, but I would include becoming active in politics in order to spread the word about my profession. Politics was one area I neglected in my life. So that's my advice. Volunteer and become politically involved.
No, like those are you're 100% set on it. You know, in some of the branches that we had in the U.S. military, a lot of times they didn't send enough general officers to the Pentagon, where really they did the politicking for that particular branch, and because of that, sometimes the progress of those particular branches were hindered. But you know, those are right on the point, and I have seen those through the time that I've served in the service and how they have impact. And you're right, the political piece of the discussions are very important to be able to give some cover for whatever profession you're in, to be able to help solidify it as you move in the future. Betty, what are you looking forward to in the next 100 years now, the next century? I mean, is there anything that you're not, you know, I don't know. I guess you got to tell us how you feel about it.
Well, I'm gonna try and get involved politically in the time left to me, and of course, become a better bowler. I still love bowling, and I bowled 2 senior leagues. I did so well a couple of weeks ago. One of my fellow bowlers says, "Hey, Betty, I want to see your birth certificate. Are you sure you're a senior?" So I thanked him for the compliment. But politically is where I would like to become involved, to sell how to remain active as I am active. I believe I've done it by staying active, which is physical therapy, and by volunteering. I've volunteered 18 years now at a VA in North Chicago, and I don't regret any of that time. Even though it's about 30 miles from me to commute back and forth.
Betty, I don't know if a lot of our listeners know how much you travel and how much you're still dedicated and serve. Even with COVID striking the country, I know that you were very cognizant of being part of a program that you wouldn't allow any vet to be alone going through these hardships. And God bless you for everything you have done. I hope that I could be as dedicated as you are as I age, in my life, to ensure that we do what we can for the betterment of the nation. We do have a short video, Betty, we're going to show after this program is over to kind of really lay out some of the stuff you had talked about what you had to go through with basic training and some of the hardships you had to go through. But it is a blessing for us in the United States that you're a piece of Americana, I call, and I am blessed to have you in my life as a dear friend. And the members of VFW 3579 are honored again to have you part of their team. I'll give you the last word, Betty.
No, other than I would certainly do it again. I have no regrets. None. I just wish more females would seriously consider not only my profession, but the service. Learn to take orders like I did. It'll help you in the long run. I thank you for the opportunity to share my experience. Thanks again.
Betty, thank you for being here. It's an honor, and I look forward to celebrating your birthday today. Oh, there's Susie in the back. There's your special guest. Without her help, it would have been really difficult for us to get here. How you doing, Susie?
I'm great. Thank you.
God's blessing. Thank you very much for having an opportunity to share Betty's story with us. With that said,
Thank you.
God bless you, Betty. Look forward to the next century. Susie, God bless the family and this new paradigms.
The Second World War
you.
dramatically changed the lives and attitudes of American women. The nation was strapped for manpower. Industry and the armed forces as well actively recruited women, asking them to take on demanding and responsible jobs outside the home, at least for the duration of the war. So many women began working in areas that had been traditionally male. But as women discovered, the men in charge considered that change only temporary. The campaign to recruit nurses to serve in the armed forces did not strike Americans as unusual. Nursing was considered an appropriate profession for women, and women as Army and Navy nurses had been part of the American scene ever since the Spanish-American War. What was surprising was the number of American nurses who answered the call in World War II and served on active duty, 74,000.
Fort Devens, Massachusetts, training center for United States Army nurses. They all have officers' ratings and go through a final 4 weeks course that closely parallels their brother officers' basic training. Thorough military orientation and physical conditioning fit them for service wherever American troops go. They'll fill jobs on hospital ships and trains, field hospitals, and behind the front lines evacuating wounded, sometimes under fire. The next time these officer nurses crawl, it may be on some foreign soil in aid of a wounded American soldier. No worry about keeping slim-waisted for these stout-hearted girls, and the Army needs thousands more like them.
America honors Army nurses who served under fire in the Philippines. Heroines of Manila, of Bataan and Corregidor, their deeds have written an epic chapter in U.S. history. Mrs. Roosevelt looks on as 6 who came back received medals for valor. To student nurses, their courage is an inspiration. Caring for the wounded until told to go, they were the last to leave.
Not all the nurses in the Philippines escaped. When Bataan and Corregidor fell to the Japanese, 11 Navy nurses, 66 Army nurses were among the Americans captured, and they spent 3 years in Japanese prison camps. As the war progressed, thousands of American nurses left the military and naval hospitals in the United States and went overseas. They served in every theater of operations, caring for the wounded, working with the surgeons, often in field hospitals very close to the actual fighting. More than 200 Army nurses were killed. 17 are buried in U.S. military cemeteries overseas. The American Armed Forces began recruiting women for non-combatant jobs to replace men who were needed to fight overseas. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Almost 300,000 American women enlisted and served on active duty during the war. These military women were not nurses. They were something new in American life.
In Washington, the commander of the newly formed Women's Army Auxiliary Corps begins her duties. A housewife and mother, she will direct an army of 250,000 women. Women who will work behind the lines, relieving more men for combat duty in the field. For the first time in history, the Army now has an authorized army of women.
Americans worried out loud and in print about the military women's safety or virtue or both. The newsreel saw her as a sexy wartime novelty and painted a bright picture of female life in the Army. In reality, the military women often had to overcome condescension, prejudice, and resentment, but they persisted. The women picked up new skills, and most important, they won a permanent place in the American Armed Forces. The Army shipped 17,000 WWIIs overseas. They were the exceptions. Most American service women, like the Coast Guard spars, were assigned to jobs in the United States.
These spars at the Coast Guard training station in Atlantic City have completed a concentrated 20 weeks course in radio reception to qualify as radio men third class. They'll replace male operators on shore stations and release the men for sea duty. Commander Dorothy Stratton awards the coveted certificates. 53 girls are freeing men to fight, but 3,000 more are needed. This is our war too, girls.